Please join us for our next edition of Book Talk TV, where we'll be speaking with Dr. Cedric Herring, author of Critical Diversity, The New Case for Inclusion and Equal Opportunity. Hello, welcome to this edition of Book Talk TV. I'm your host, Jenny Korn, and I'm a doctoral student in the field of communication at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Our guest is Dr. Cedric Herring, author of Critical Diversity, The New Case for Inclusion and Equal Opportunity. Dr. Herring is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago and director of the Race and Public Policy program in the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. He has published 8 books and more than 60 scholarly articles. Dr. Herring has published widely on topics such as diversity, social policy, labor force issues and policy, stratification and inequality, and the sociology of African Americans. His most recent book with co-author Lauren Henderson is Critical Diversity, The New Case for Inclusion and Equal Opportunity. Hello, Dr. Herring, and welcome to Book Talk TV.
I'm happy to be here.
What led you to write the book?
I would say it this way. I grew up in the South during the time of segregation. It was a time when there was vast gender inequality, a time where there was great disparity between people who had lots of wealth and poverty. And it was a time when poor people lived on one side of the tracks, rich people lived on the other side of the tracks. And I always wondered what made these different kinds of people come together and stay apart. I also wondered why it was that certain people had lots of education, lots of income, great jobs, fancy houses, and other people had just the opposite. And so I always wanted to know what made my town tick and why it was that we had such vast differences in how people didn't get along and what could be done to make it so that people would get along with each other. And so I decided that I wanted to study sociology. And so I went to college and I started studying sociology to try to find answers to these kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And I studied a long time. I got my bachelor's degree. Then I went on and went to graduate school. And in going to graduate school, I thought, oh, now maybe I'll really find answers to these questions. And so I dedicated myself to studying sociology, and in particular studying issues of race, class, gender inequality, sexuality, things along those lines. And I tried to get a better understanding of why you had such disparities in our society. So that's a long answer to your question, and I'm about to get to the real answer of it. And so in pursuing sociology, I started doing research. And I did research on these issues, and once I started getting a better understanding of some of the what I would call structural issues that underlie these kinds of patterns and dynamics, I started trying to explain to other people, and I started doing more research and trying to publish that research. And in doing that, I became even more curious about how society works, and I then started saying, there are in fact these kinds of fundamental dynamics that operate in our society. And about 5 years ago or so, I started doing systematic research on affirmative action, and that led to inquiries about diversity and how that operates in our society. And I was encouraged by my co-author, Lauren Henderson, to take what was bits and pieces of article and academic research and try to convert it into something that had more appeal to a broader audience and to focus strictly on diversity per se. And what we tried to do together, in fact, is to try to change the way that people thought about diversity, to try to make it a more critical kind of concept so that we didn't just deal with the superficial surface issues dealing with diversity, but to look at how, in fact, it could be contentious and why it is that even though people say that they embrace diversity and enjoy that concept and things like that, why it was that there are all these difficulties around difference. The second thing that I wanted to do in trying to bring forth this book is to show that, in fact, diversity does pay, because I'd done research that demonstrated that. And so I wanted to show in a systematic way that diversity does have tangible benefits for people, for the society, for business organizations, for nonprofits, etc. But I wanted to go beyond that and to show that that's not the only reason why we should embrace and encourage diversity. And finally, I wanted to make diversity a policy issue so that, in fact, we could, in fact, do things to redress some of the inequalities that exist and persist in our society. And so for all of those reasons, back from when I was a kid, back in the South, back in Texas, all the way through undergraduate, graduate school, as a professor, as a researcher, all of these things have led me to the point of saying it is important to try to get diversity and critical diversity on the policy agenda so that it becomes an issue that people care about and are concerned about and think about in a certain way. And so for those reasons.
That's great. Could you elaborate on some of the issues in the book?
Sure. The book tries to offer a new theoretical perspective about diversity, one that we call critical diversity. And by critical diversity, we mean it is a kind of diversity that can be defined in terms of equal participation of people of different kinds and different backgrounds on a parity basis within any kind of organization or structure, so that there is equal inclusion and equal distribution of opportunities and access to all kinds of opportunities for everybody. And we are talking about especially including people who are traditionally locked out of a process. And it is important for us, in terms of this theoretical perspective that we're pushing, that it is, in fact, on a parity basis. Now, we talk about critical diversity, and people have different notions of what diversity even means. I guess, strictly speaking, that diversity just means differences. But what we came to realize is that people are walking around with different notions of diversity in their heads. One kind of diversity that we talk about is what we can think of as being so-called colorblind diversity. And it's the notion that people really don't see differences. It's sort of like they give a pretend, and they say, because we're all so different, we shouldn't make any differences, which is kind of puzzling to me in all honesty, that on the one hand, we're saying that we acknowledge that there are differences, but let's pretend that those differences don't exist. And so that's the notion of color blindness or gender neutrality, or it's almost like we pretend and we're ostriches. There's another kind of diversity that we also became aware of. And in the book, we refer to it as snowflake diversity. And with that, it is the notion that, everybody is so unique, just like every snowflake is unique and it's different. And so, of course, people are different. But groups don't matter because in that uniqueness, we can't make any differences about people. But what we say is that these differences do, in fact, matter, and they do have implications for power differences, for hierarchy, for how people are treated, how people are mistreated, opportunities that people get, et cetera. And so or saying that we are only individuals misses the point when we're talking about diversity. A third kind of diversity that we compare critical diversity to is what we call segregated diversity. Segregated diversity is the notion that you do have differences within organizations. Let's say, for example, the U.S. military, which prides itself on being inclusive and gets much credit for being successful in integrating and including all kinds of people. But even with the U.S. military, you will see that there is segregated diversity in the following sense, that as you move from the top of the organization to from the bottom of the organization to the top, you'll see that it starts off dark and it becomes lighter as you go higher up in the ranks. You'll also see things like a scarcity of women, and in particular branches of the military and in particular kinds of positions within the military. You'll see that there are clusters of women, but then you'll see other areas where there are very few. And so this is a notion of segregated diversity. And until recently, you also had the notion of don't ask, don't tell within the military, which goes counter to the notion of we don't have a single person to waste, because if in fact you are telling people that as soon as they let people know that they were LGBT, that is gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, etc., then they would be put out of the military. And so these notions of diversity are not as inclusive in providing people with as much equal opportunity as is necessary for diversity to have the kinds of benefits that we say it should have. And so we're promoting the notion of critical diversity. Now, if you want me to go through what the book talks about, I'm happy to do that.
What is the overall purpose of this book?
Basically to show that diversity does in fact have tangible benefits in the society, that diversity does pay. But we believe that we can't just stop there. We say that we need to demonstrate how and why diversity matters in terms of how people get along with each other. In the book, we talk about concrete practices and policies that can be put in place so that organizations can more effectively recruit and retain women, people of color, people from the LGBT community, people who have been disenfranchised, people who have been excluded on a systematic basis. And so we're trying to show through social science evidence the kinds of best practices that can in fact be put in place to make those kinds of things happen. We're also talking about some of the kinds of things that businesses and other organizations can do to avoid problems with managing diversity. And so we show how diversity can be successfully managed. We also talk about things that are problematic in terms of organizations, like gender or sex segregation within organizations. Again, it's one thing for organizations to have people of all sorts, but it is another thing when women, for example, are in one part of the organization and men are in another part. And so you have people segregated by occupation. So men and women doing very different kinds of jobs within the same organization. It's not problematic if it is completely on the basis of self-selection, but if it is due to people being blocked in terms of opportunities, very problematic as far as we're concerned. We also talk about things that are related to that, things that in fact do to some degree drive gender segregation within organizations. And those are things like sexual harassment. And so in the book, we systematically deal with some of the things that lead to sexual harassment in organizations and what can be done to reduce those kinds of things so that women in particular will feel more free and more at ease in terms of choosing to work in certain kinds of jobs and in climates that are not hostile to them. We also talk about discrimination and persisting discrimination along racial lines. And we talk about the need for continued affirmative action policies and programs and initiatives so that, again, you can recruit people and so that you can include all kinds of people in organizations. We also talk about making the work environment more LGBT friendly and what kinds of things can be done and put in place to make people feel free to be themselves in the workplace. Because again, we believe that it is then that organizations can be most effective and efficient and productive and profitable and more inclusive. We also tip our hat to higher education, and we talk about some of the conflicts and strifes on college campuses, things that need to be done to make different kinds of students feel welcome and included. We also talk about things that can be done to identify, recruit, and promote faculty of different kinds, faculty of color, women in especially STEM disciplines, and things that can be done to create a pipeline from elementary schools, high schools, colleges, and we talk about so-called 10% plans that have been implemented in certain states that have abolished affirmative action. And we talk about how these programs ironically can be used to promote diversity. And we talk about some of the other difficult issues like the politics behind diversity, about how on the surface so many people embrace diversity, but when you get to the nitty-gritty aspects of it, it becomes difficult and politically contentious, especially it creates angst, particularly among white men who believe that often they are being deprived of opportunities to provide opportunities to other people. And so we talk about what can be done to make the politics of diversity less contentious and more politically palatable, and how we can be effective in implementing these kinds of programs and policies. And so those are some of the themes that the book touches on, and some of the kinds of things that we hope that readers will take away when they read the book. And so that's kind of the purpose of it. Again, I know I'm a professor, long-winded answers, trying not to do that, and so maybe I'll be a bit more brief on some other ones. So.
Speaking of readers, who might benefit from reading this book?
Well, we believe that this is a book that should be of interest and has some takeaway points for anybody who cares about the issues of diversity. And these can be people from the business community who want to know how better to operate their organizations. It can be people from nonprofit organizations who want to see how to recruit different kinds of members. It should be useful to university administrators. It should be useful to students who want to learn how to go into, for example, human resources fields. It should be useful to professors who want to provide to their students some kind of social science background material on diversity and implementing diversity and some of the kinds of dynamics where we talk about wealth inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality, sexuality differences, and things like that. Anybody who cares about some of the most important and sometimes the most contentious issues in American society, we think could learn from this. And it is pitched, we have tried to make it as non-technical as possible, even though it does bring some of the best of what social science has to offer in terms of evidence.
Let's take a step back. How did you go about writing this book?
Well, the book was written initially, and I have to thank my co-author again for changing the flow and the vibe of the book, because initially it consisted primarily of academic articles that were fairly technical. But my co-author, Lauren Henderson, helped breathe life into the book by saying, we need to tell more stories. And what happened in terms of the process of writing the book, it often would be conversations that we would have. Some might say arguments, debates, disagreements, sometimes smooth, sometimes not so easy, but they've all been resolved at this point. They've all been resolved. And so often we would record our conversations. And so hopefully some of the book has a more conversational feel and style to it. And so these conversations lent themselves to writing the book, even though we would have to substantiate points with solid academic evidence. But a lot of it came from these conversations that we had, and so that was the writing process often.
Then overall, how long did it take to write this book?
Well, arguably you could say that it's taken a lifetime, because like I said, it was these experiences from when I was a child that have informed how I even think about issues and questions and things like that. But I would say that the process of there even being a kernel of an idea for the book started probably about 5 years ago, when I was able to publish an article in the American Sociological Review called "Does Diversity Pay?" And in that article, it systematically dealt with the economic return to diversity for organizations. And so in that article, I was able to document that diversity increases the profitability of companies, that it increases the market share, that it increases the number of customers, and all these kinds of great things that many people who have hoped about diversity had claimed. And I was able to demonstrate that in what I would consider one of the leading social science journals.
Yep.
And from that, there was an amazing amount of media coverage of that. And I would also say that more popular magazines, or maybe these are trade magazines, started picking up things like this. For example, Diversity Inc. magazine identified that research as being among the one of the 5 top articles on diversity written.
Wow.
And this made me think, along with Lauren Henderson's prodding, that this is a topic that needs to be fleshed out, that needs to be developed and amplified. And so it was at that point that I started thinking about writing a book. But like I said, my inclination is to do something that's way too academic. And I think we tried to make it a bit way less technical and more conversational. And in that, so it's taken now, I guess, 5 years from conception to, if I actually had the physical book here, I'd say to that point, but to actually write it, about 3 years or so.
Okay. What was the biggest challenge in writing this book?
I would say the biggest challenge would be things like, just like for anybody, it is other commitments that you have, like teaching classes, family, committee work, all these, working with students, which, I love doing that, but, these are things that actually do take away from the time that you would like to devote to working on the book. But I would also have to say that some of the time was spent on conceptualizing and reconceptualizing and rethinking how to think about some of these issues and how to frame them, and getting up to speed not only in terms of my own discipline, but how several other disciplines have dealt with the issue of diversity and trying to engage with those works and things. And so all of that background work took time to get up to speed to be able to deliver to readers what we hope is a very good product. Well, what we know is a very good product.
What is your favorite part of the book?
Well, asking what's the favorite part of a book is sort of like asking which is your favorite child, right? And so what I would say is that I love the whole book. But I do have to say that it was in working with Lauren on Chapter 2, which fleshes out the whole theory of critical diversity, that talks about it versus these other concepts, that was probably for me the most challenging, but also the most fun now that I look back at it, because it really does provide this new perspective that is very different from anything that I've seen before, that builds on the business case, but then amplifies it to talk about how and why making equal opportunity a centerpiece makes it even more profitable and beneficial for organizations. And so that's got to be my favorite part. And if these other chapters are saying, but what about me? What about me? I like them all.
What do you wish was different about the book?
Well, the one thing that I would say is that I wish that the book could have been a bit shorter. But if we had made the book shorter, we would not have been able to include as many examples of successful diversity organizations, or organizations that went from laggards to leaders, as we call them. We wouldn't have been able to flesh out some of these ideas as thoroughly. We wouldn't have been able to talk about things that are on the horizon. And in fact, I wish that we had devoted more space and time to some of the emerging or issues on the horizon, like the issue of disability, like the issue of religion and contention around religion, where we have Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and things along those lines. Also generational issues about the baby boomers and Generation X, Generation Y, etc., and lines of schisms along these kinds of lines. But again, fleshing out these things and especially trying to watch them as they unfold in an era of economic uncertainty would have been great, but it would have taken much longer to do the book, and this book that is already long would have been even longer.
Right.
And so, you have to fish and cut bait at some point, so
sure,
we did.
Sure.
Okay.
Why now?
Well, I honestly don't believe there's another book out there right now that offers a compelling theory of diversity, that offers a compelling reason why we need to take diversity seriously and get to the underbelly of it, and also talk about the promise of diversity and what we can do to make it work more effectively. And so now, especially in this era of economic uncertainty, where many businesses are cutting back on diversity initiatives and programs and things like that, I think it's important to get out there the message to demonstrate that diversity does pay, and to show not only that it pays, but why we have to do things that go beyond its profitability.
Sure. What expertise do you bring to this book?
Well, as you said in the introduction, I am a professor of sociology and public policy. I am a former president of the Association of Black Sociologists. I'm a former director of a research institute that deals with issues around race and public policy. I have done, should I age myself? Decades, about 20 years of research on issues of social inequality that people now talk about as intersectionality. And I think I have always been concerned about issues of what people call intersectionality. We happen to call it diversity. It is race, class, gender, sexuality, and other forms of inequality and inequity. And I have devoted my life to understanding how those issues unfold and how they intersect with policy and how they intersect with the political realm. And so I think I'm as well situated to talk about those issues as probably anybody.
And in terms of theory and practicality, how would you characterize this book?
Well, I would say that Critical Diversity is a book that offers theory, but it also tries to provide some practical guidance to people who have to manage diversity within their organizations. And so it's not a how-to book, but it does offer guidance in terms of what does the best of what social science has to offer say are best practices in terms of this and in terms of that. And it talks about cases of companies, and maybe I shouldn't invoke them, but I'll say Caterpillar, that went from a company that was so bad in terms of its racial and gender diversity to becoming now an international leader in that. Or Denny's, that had serious problems with race relations with customers and with its workforce, and what they did to implement things so that they could become way better at it. And so it's a book that offers theory, but then makes it practical to the person who's on the ground in terms of what they need to do to make their organization work effectively.
Great. Do you have a website for the book?
Well, the website of the book, coincidentally, is just like the title of the book. The title of the book, Critical Diversity. The website, www.criticaldiversity.com.
Great. That's all the time we have for this edition of Book Talk TV. Dr. Herring, thank you for sharing your thoughts about critical diversity, the new case for inclusion and equal opportunity. I'm your host, Jenny Korn. We'll see you next time on Book Talk TV.